April 21st, 1945. A forest clearing between Duisburg and Lintorf, Germany. Field Marshal Walter Model stood alone among the trees, his service pistol heavy in his hand. Behind him lay the ruins of Army Group B, more than 300,000 men who had surrendered to American forces over the preceding days. Before him stretched an impossible choice that was no choice at all. He could not surrender and violate his oath. He would not witness Soviet captivity for his homeland. The shot that rang out through those woods that afternoon marked more than one man's death. It symbolized the culmination of a phenomenon that would mystify military historians for generations to come. Between March and May 1945, nearly 3 million German soldiers surrendered to American and Western Allied forces, often walking miles through their own defensive lines to reach American positions, throwing down weapons without firing a shot, emerging from fortified positions with white flags fashioned from bedsheets and tablecloths. They surrendered not because their lines had collapsed, not because ammunition had run dry, not even because the war was lost. They surrendered specifically, deliberately, desperately to avoid one fate above all others: capture by the Soviet Red Army. The numbers tell a story of unprecedented mass capitulation. From June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, to April 30, 1945, the day Hitler died in his Berlin bunker, over 2.8 million German soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces on the northwestern European front. Of these staggering numbers, 1.5 million surrendered in April 1945 alone. During the first 2 weeks of that month, 39,000 Germans surrendered daily. In the final 16 days, that number peaked at 59,000 per day. These men gave themselves up while Hitler still lived, while the Nazi government still functioned, while military law still demanded they fight to the death. They possessed weapons, ammunition, and defensive positions. What they lacked was the will to face eastward, where the Red Army ground forward like an unstoppable machine of vengeance and retribution. To understand why nearly 3 million German soldiers would choose surrender over continued resistance requires understanding what they knew about two very different fates. Every German soldier on the Western Front in 1945 had heard the stories from the East. They circulated in whispered conversations, in letters that made it through military censors, in the 1,000-yard stares of men transferred westward from the Eastern Front. These were not propaganda tales designed to motivate resistance. These were testimonies from men who had witnessed firsthand what happened when German forces fell into Soviet hands. They knew about Stalingrad, where 91,000 survivors of the Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943. They knew that of those 91,000 men, only approximately 6,000 would ever return home. The rest died in the months following surrender, succumbing to starvation, disease, exposure, and forced labor in Soviet captivity. They knew about the death marches, where Soviet forces herded captured Germans hundreds of miles into the Russian interior without adequate food, water, or rest, shooting those who could not maintain the pace. They knew about the mining camps in Siberia, the labor battalions in the Urals, the brutal conditions that killed over 1 million German prisoners before 1956. They knew these things not as distant possibilities, but as statistical certainties. The West German Maschke Commission, established after the war to investigate POW fates, documented that 1,094,250 German prisoners died in Soviet custody out of 3,060,000 captured. For a German soldier contemplating surrender, this meant better than 1 in 3 odds of death even after the shooting stopped. But the fear that drove Germans westward went deeper than survival statistics. It resided in the profound awareness of what German forces had done in the Soviet Union. From June 22, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa launched the largest military invasion in human history, German troops had waged what they themselves called a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. Nazi ideology had designated Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans fit only for enslavement or extermination. German planners had drawn up schemes for the systematic starvation of 30 million Soviet civilians to create Lebensraum, living space for German settlers. The Wehrmacht had deliberately starved 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war to death out of 5.7 million captured, a death rate of 57%. For comparison, only 3.5% of British and American POWs died in German custody. German forces had participated directly in the Holocaust on Soviet territory, where 2 million of the 6 million murdered Jews were killed. They had burned villages, executed partisans and suspected partisans along with their families, implemented collective punishment policies that murdered entire communities. The blood of 26 million Soviet soldiers and civilians stained German hands. Every German soldier in 1945 knew this, whether or not he had personally pulled a trigger or lit a torch. They understood that when Soviet forces came for them, they came not merely as military adversaries, but as instruments of righteous vengeance for crimes beyond counting. The contrast with American forces could not have been more stark. From the first moments of contact, German soldiers encountered an American way of warfare that defied everything Nazi propaganda had told them about their enemies. From the first moments of contact with American forces, the treatment German soldiers received confounded their expectations. American forces, following explicit orders from Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower, maintained strict adherence to international law regarding prisoners of war. Medical care was provided. Adequate rations were distributed. The wounded received treatment. Prisoners were not executed, tortured, or subjected to forced labor in violation of Geneva Convention provisions. The reputation of American treatment spread through German lines faster than any official communication could have traveled. Soldiers who had surrendered earlier were sometimes held in temporary enclosures visible from German defensive positions. Their countrymen could see them alive, relatively unharmed, receiving food and medical attention. This visual confirmation of survival proved more powerful than any propaganda. When the 317,000 men of the Ruhr Pocket began surrendering en masse between April 14th and 18th, 1945, many had made the calculation explicitly. They faced encirclement, dwindling supplies, and the choice between breaking out eastward toward German lines and Soviet pursuit, or westward toward American positions. Field Marshal Model had dissolved Army Group B rather than formally surrender, giving his men implicit permission to choose their own fate. The overwhelming majority walked west. The strategic calculation was not merely individual self-preservation, but a form of national self-preservation. By May 1945, thoughtful Germans understood that their nation's survival depended on Western Allied, particularly American, willingness to permit German reconstruction rather than Soviet-style occupation and exploitation. The flood of surrenders in spring 1945 had begun to take shape months earlier, as military realities made German defeat inevitable. After D-Day on June 6, 1944, when American, British and Canadian forces established their beachhead in Normandy, the Western Front became a slowly tightening noose. By September, Allied forces had liberated France. By December, they stood at Germany's western border despite the temporary setback of the Battle of the Bulge. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet juggernaut that had been building since the victory at Stalingrad ground inexorably westward. Operation Bagration, launched on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Barbarossa, destroyed German Army Group Center and cost Germany between 400,000 and 450,000 casualties in 9 weeks, the largest German defeat in military history. By January 1945, Soviet forces stood on German soil in East Prussia and had advanced to within 100 miles of Berlin. The German military found itself in a strategic vice, compressed between two massive Allied armies, its manpower exhausted, its industrial capacity crippled by strategic bombing, its fuel supplies nearly depleted. But the crucial detail, The factor that drove German soldiers to make their desperate choice was that these two Allied armies represented two completely different futures for captured Germans. The policy decisions of German leadership in early 1945 reveal the extent to which they recognized this reality and attempted to exploit it. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who assumed leadership of Germany after Hitler's suicide on April 30th, pursued what historians would later call a strategy of successive partial capitulations in the West. His goal, made explicit in captured German documents now held in the National Archives, was to play for time in order to bring as many Eastern military formations westward as possible and surrender them intact to the British and Americans while saving them from Soviet or Yugoslav captivity. Beginning with the Italian surrender on April 29, 1945, Dönitz attempted to negotiate separate surrenders to Western Allied forces while continuing to fight the Soviets. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepted the surrender of German forces in the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and Denmark on May 4th. On May 6th, General Alfred Jodl arrived at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims and offered to surrender all forces fighting the Western Allies while continuing to resist Soviet forces. General Eisenhower's response demolished this strategy. He threatened to close all Western lines to German soldiers, forcing them to surrender to the Soviets, unless Germany agreed to unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously. Faced with this ultimatum, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, at Reims, ending the war in Europe. The Soviets, suspicious that they had been excluded from a separate peace, insisted on a second signing ceremony in Berlin-Karlshorst on May 8 with Soviet participation, which they considered the official legal surrender. The Battle of Halbe provides perhaps the most dramatic illustration of German desperation to avoid Soviet captivity. From April 24 to May 1, 1945, the remnants of the German Ninth Army, approximately 200,000 soldiers plus tens of thousands of civilian refugees, found themselves encircled by Soviet forces in a shrinking pocket southeast of Berlin. Their commander, General Theodor Busse, ordered a breakout attempt westward toward American positions near the Elbe River, knowing that surrender to the Soviets meant likely death. What followed was a bloodbath. Soviet artillery, tanks, and infantry hammered the pocket mercilessly. German forces fought with the energy of desperation, not to achieve military objectives, but simply to break through the Soviet ring and reach the Americans. Approximately 30,000 German soldiers succeeded in breaking through to reach American lines, about one-third of those encircled, representing a partial German success in the breakout attempt. Total deaths, including both military personnel and civilians, likely reached 24,000 to 60,000. For comparison, in the Battle of the Ruhr Pocket, where Germans surrendered to Americans, approximately 10,000 died, including civilians, foreign labourers, and irregular forces, while 317,000 were taken prisoner. The contrast speaks volumes about which fate German soldiers preferred. The German government's own post-war commission, headed by Erich Maschke, investigated the fate of German POWs and found that approximately 3 million were taken by the Soviet Union, of whom 1,094,250 died in captivity between 1941 and 1955. The Commission documented that 549,360 died between 1941 and April 1945, and 542,911 died between May 1945 and June 1950 after the war's end. These figures, derived from German records and Soviet archives, paint a picture of systematic mortality. The death rate in Soviet captivity exceeded 35%. For Germans held by the Americans, fewer than 1% died in custody. The men surrendering in spring 1945 did not have access to these precise statistics, but they understood the fundamental truth they represented. Soviet captivity meant a high probability of death. American captivity meant a high probability of survival. The treatment German POWs received at American hands initially occurred under difficult circumstances. The Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps where hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were initially held in open fields, were established rapidly in April 1945 to handle the unexpected flood of surrenders. The logistical challenge of processing 1.5 million prisoners in a single month while still conducting active military operations stretched resources severely. Conditions were difficult, particularly in the first weeks, with inadequate shelter and food shortages as supply lines struggled to keep pace with the numbers. However, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force worked to improve conditions, and by summer 1945, prisoners were being transferred to permanent camps with proper facilities. The actual death toll in these camps, according to the 1974 Maschke Commission report, was approximately 4,000 to 6,000 prisoners, representing roughly a 1% death rate. Claims by author James Back of 800,000 to 1 million deaths have been thoroughly discredited by academic consensus, with historians demonstrating that his other losses column represented administrative transfers and discharges, not deaths. The rapidity with which organised German resistance collapsed in the West, compared to the bitter fighting that continued in the East until the final day, demonstrates the extent of this preference. Consider the distribution of German casualties. German military deaths totalled approximately 5.3 million, according to historian Rudiger Overmann's definitive statistical study. Of these, approximately 4 million deaths occurred on the Eastern Front, representing 75 to 80% of all German war dead, versus approximately 1 million on Western and other fronts. The ferocity of combat, the no-quarter nature of the fighting, and the determination of both sides to fight to the finish produced casualty rates far exceeding those in the West. In the Battle of Berlin alone, fought from April 16th to May 2nd, 1945, German forces suffered approximately 92,000 to 100,000 killed, 220,000 wounded, and 480,000 captured. The city was defended house by house, street by street, with Hitler Youth and Volkssturm fighting alongside Wehrmacht regulars. Ammunition ran out, food ran out, medical supplies ran out. Still the defenders fought on, even as Soviet artillery reduced the city to rubble. On the Western Front, by contrast, German units with ammunition, with defensive positions, with the capability to resist, chose not to. The surrender of the Ruhr Pocket illustrated this dynamic perfectly. From April 1st, when American forces completed the encirclement, to April 18th, when the last resistance ended, German defenders had every geographic advantage. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heartland, a densely populated urban region with factories, buildings and infrastructure that favoured defenders. Army Group B had 370,000 men, 19 divisions, ample ammunition and defensive positions. Had they chosen to fight a Stalingrad-style urban defence, American forces would have paid a terrible price to take the pocket. Instead, mass surrenders began on April 14th after model-dissolved Army Group B. Entire divisions walked into American custody without firing a shot. The 116th Panzer Division, a veteran formation that had fought from Normandy through the Ardennes, surrendered with neither serviceable tanks nor artillery remaining, but the men themselves were intact and capable of infantry resistance. They chose captivity over combat. Total American casualties in reducing the Ruhr Pocket numbered approximately 10,000. German surrenders numbered 317,000. The mathematics of that exchange, fewer than one American casualty for every 30 Germans captured, indicates that most Germans gave up without a fight. This pattern repeated across Western Germany in April 1945. American forces advancing through central Germany encountered what Eisenhower called a whipped army. Towns and cities surrendered with white flags and token resistance or no resistance at all. German units retreated only to surrender at the next encounter. The daily rate of captures tells the story with brutal clarity. In March 1945, American and British forces were taking approximately 10,000 German prisoners per day. In the first 2 weeks of April, that number surged to 39,000 per day. In the final 16 days of April, it peaked at 59,000 per day. These were not all combat captures of surrounded or defeated units. Many were voluntary surrenders of formations that had walked away from defensive positions to give themselves up. The strategic calculation these soldiers made was explicit. They could see the end approaching and had made their decision. If they held their positions and fought the Americans, they delayed the inevitable by perhaps days, and then Soviet forces would sweep across Germany from the east while they bled themselves out fighting in the west. If they retreated eastward, they eventually fell into Soviet hands. The Americans were their only chance to survive this war and rebuild afterward. By May 1945, thoughtful Germans understood that their nation's survival depended on Western Allied willingness to permit German reconstruction. German soldiers who surrendered to Americans were, in effect, choosing which post-war Germany they wanted to live in. The question of why German forces in the East continued to fight with such determination, even as the West collapsed, requires understanding the different nature of defeat in the two theatres. In the West, German forces could surrender and expect to survive. Individual commanders could calculate that giving up their men to American captivity preserved those lives for Germany's future. In the East, surrender offered no such assurance. The death rate in Soviet captivity meant that giving up a unit to the Red Army potentially sentenced 1 in 3 men to death. Commanders who had led their men through years of brutal warfare could not bring themselves to condemn them to that fate without exhausting every other option. Moreover, in the East, every day of continued resistance theoretically allowed more German civilians to flee westward away from Soviet advance. The refugee crisis that engulfed eastern Germany in early 1945 saw millions of German civilians, primarily women, children and elderly, fleeing the approaching Red Army. These refugees had heard the stories too. They fled westward by any means available, on foot, in horse carts, in overcrowded trains, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. German military forces in the East saw their role, in the war's final weeks, as providing a shield for this civilian evacuation. This complex mixture of military pragmatism, national loyalty, personal fear, and awareness of collective guilt shaped German surrender decisions in 1945. The men making these choices were not primarily motivated by moral recognition of their crimes, though some did express such awareness. They were soldiers making decisions about survival under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Their choice to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets reflected a rational calculation of which option offered the best chance of living through the war's end. That calculation was shaped by their knowledge of their own crimes on the Eastern Front and the inevitable Soviet response, by their observation of American treatment of prisoners, and by their assessment of post-war realities. The final days of the war in Europe saw this dynamic play out with dramatic intensity. After the unconditional surrender was signed on May 7th and 8th, 1945, German forces in some areas continued fighting briefly, attempting to reach Western lines before the surrender became effective. The Ruhr Pocket in Latvia, where Army Group North had been cut off since October 1944, surrendered to Soviet forces on May 9th after the grace period expired. German forces in Czechoslovakia fought Soviet troops while attempting to break through to American positions. The Prague Uprising, which began on May 5th when Czech resistance groups attacked German forces, escalated into brutal street fighting. German units responded with extreme violence, even as the war had officially ended, because they feared that Czech partisans would turn them over to Soviet forces. Only when American and Soviet forces met and established clear demarcation lines did the fighting finally cease. The experience of capture, for those Germans who did surrender to American forces, would shape their post-war memories and their relationship with the United States for decades. The Rheinwiesen Lager period, difficult as it was, gave way to relatively humane treatment as prisoners were transferred to permanent camps and eventually repatriated. Most German POWs held by Western allies returned home between 1945 and 1948. They returned to a destroyed Germany, to cities reduced to rubble by strategic bombing, to an economy in collapse, to a nation divided between occupation zones. But they returned alive. They married, raised families, rebuilt their communities, and became citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany in the West or the German Democratic Republic in the East, depending on where they settled. Many became ardent supporters of Western democracy and the Atlantic Alliance. The Soviet prisoners held by the Soviet Union faced a very different future. The approximately 480,000 captured during the Battle of Berlin and the million-plus taken in the final months on the Eastern Front entered a system designed to extract maximum labour before release. The Soviet Union had suffered staggering destruction during the war. 26 million dead, 1,700 cities and towns destroyed, 32,000 factories demolished. The German invasion had created an economic catastrophe that would take decades to remedy. Soviet authorities, while officially committed to Geneva Convention principles, prioritized reconstruction over prisoner welfare. German POWs became a forced labor force, working in mines, factories, construction projects, and agriculture. Conditions improved after the crisis years of 1945 to 1946, when famine threatened the Soviet Union and prisoners barely survived on starvation rations. By 1947, mortality rates had declined significantly as the Soviet economy stabilized. But repatriation came slowly. Most German POWs were released between 1947 and 1950, but the last did not return home until 1956, 11 years after the war's end. The legacy of these surrender decisions extended far beyond individual survival. The nearly 3 million German soldiers who surrendered to Western forces became the foundation of West German society in the post-war period. They returned home with experience of American military power, American organizational efficiency, American willingness to treat enemies according to established rules. These experiences, combined with the Marshall Plan aid that rebuilt West Germany and the American security guarantee that protected against Soviet expansion, created the foundation for the Federal Republic's orientation toward the West and integration into NATO. The generation of German leaders who built post-war democracy had, many of them, personally chosen American captivity over Soviet revenge. The question of whether these German soldiers who surrendered en masse in 1945 faced justice for their participation in Nazi crimes remains complex and unresolved. The vast majority were never prosecuted. War crimes trials focused on senior leadership, SS members, concentration camp personnel, and those directly involved in specific atrocities. The ordinary Wehrmacht soldier, even if he had served on the Eastern Front, even if he had witnessed or participated in crimes, generally returned home after captivity without facing legal accountability. This created a situation where millions of men who had participated in a war of aggression and genocide returned to civilian life and integrated into post-war society. The Soviet Union's different approach to captured Germans reflected different priorities and different historical experiences. Soviet authorities attempted to use German POW labor to rebuild what German invasion had destroyed. They held prisoners longer, worked them harder, and released them more slowly than Western allies. The division of Germany into occupation zones, which hardened into the division between East and West Germany, meant that German soldiers' choices about surrender in 1945 often determined which Germany they would live in afterward. Those who surrendered in the West generally returned to West Germany. Those captured in the East generally settled in East Germany after release. Looking back across the decades, the mass German surrender of 1945 stands as one of the most dramatic military collapses in history, remarkable not for its rapidity but for its selectivity. German forces did not simply give up when defeat became inevitable. They gave up to specific enemies while continuing to resist others. They made rational calculations about survival and acted on those calculations en masse. The nearly 3 million who surrendered to Western allies were voting with their feet and their weapons against continued Nazi resistance and against Soviet captivity. They chose survival over honor, the future over the past, American pragmatism over Soviet revenge. The final accounting of World War II in Europe thus includes this remarkable statistic. German military resistance collapsed in the West, where soldiers could surrender and expect to live, while fighting continued in the East, where surrender meant possible death. The casualties reflect this asymmetry. German killed and wounded vastly exceeded prisoners taken on the Eastern Front. German prisoners vastly exceeded killed and wounded on the Western Front. The human cost of this divergence was immense. Every German soldier who died fighting the Red Army in 1945 was a man who might have lived if geography had placed him facing Americans instead. Every Soviet soldier who died in 1945 fighting Germans fell defeating an enemy who was simultaneously surrendering en masse in the West. For the Americans who received this flood of surrenders, the experience was both validating and disturbing. American forces prided themselves on adherence to military law and proper treatment of prisoners. The mass surrenders confirmed that German soldiers recognized American discipline and fairness. Yet American commanders also understood why Germans were surrendering. They knew about the Eastern Front. They knew what German forces had done in the Soviet Union. They were aware that Germans were fleeing justice more than seeking mercy. General Eisenhower, in his communications with Soviet counterparts, had to navigate the delicate balance between honoring alliance commitments and managing the human flood at his force's doorstep. The post-war years revealed the lasting impact of these surrender decisions. West Germany, populated substantially by men who had surrendered to Western allies, became a prosperous democracy and a key American ally. East Germany, where many former POWs from Soviet captivity settled after release, became a communist dictatorship under Soviet control. When the two Germanys reunified in 1990, the psychological legacy of these wartime decisions still shaped German society. The Atlantic orientation of unified Germany, its commitment to NATO and European integration, its partnership with the United States, all rested partly on foundations laid when millions of German soldiers decided that Americans were enemies they could surrender to and survive. The story of why German forces surrendered in such massive numbers to Western allies rather than face the Soviets is ultimately a story of rational choice under extreme circumstances. The contrast between the fates awaiting prisoners in East versus West was stark and undeniable. Those who surrendered to Americans faced approximately a 1% chance of death in captivity. Those who fell into Soviet hands faced better than a 1 in 3 chance of never returning home. Given that choice, millions walked west. The 480,000 German soldiers captured by Soviet forces during the Battle of Berlin had no such choice. Surrounded in the capital, with no American army to surrender to, they fought to the last, and then faced the fate their countrymen had spent months desperately trying to avoid. The soldiers who surrendered rather than fight faced no Americans in final battle. Instead, they faced a future where Americans would be allies rather than enemies, where survival was possible, where Germany could rebuild. They surrendered their weapons but saved their lives. In the brutal calculus of war's end, they made the choice that 3 million men facing death would make. They walked toward those most likely to let them live. That this choice was available to them in the West, but not the East, explains the dramatic asymmetry of German resistance in 1945. It explains why the Western Front collapsed while the Eastern Front fought on. It explains why American forces took nearly 3 million prisoners while suffering relatively light casualties, while Soviet forces had to fight for every mile, every city, every building, at tremendous cost in blood. The mathematics of Allied victory in Europe were written not just in battlefield tactics and strategic bombing, but in the fundamental difference between two forms of captivity. One offered survival, the other offered likely death. German soldiers, whatever their crimes, whatever their ideology, whatever their loyalty to the Nazi regime, understood this difference. When given the opportunity, they chose to live. That choice, multiplied across millions of individual decisions in the spring of 1945, ended major German resistance in the West, accelerated the war's conclusion, and shaped the post-war world in ways that persist to this day.